Why does it feel so natural to arrive at conclusions so quickly? Why does it feel reasonable to decide what something means almost as soon as we encounter it? Well, underneath this is an assumption that's usually invisible. We act as though we're outside what we're interacting with. We act as though we're looking from a neutral place, taking something in from a clean distance, then forming a conclusion based on what's there. That isn't what's happening. The moment something appears, we're already involved. Our body responds, our attention organizes, memory, expectation, preference, fear, prior experience, all of it begins shaping what stands out and what slips under our radar. We aren't standing apart from the interaction and then deciding what it is, we're already participating in it. That changes the whole thing. Because if we're already inside what's happening, then our perception is never some untouched external view. It's always mediated by what we are. But most people don't experience that way. Most people experience themselves as simply perceiving. They take their reading to be a clear one. They experience their interpretation as a straightforward or justified response to what's there. And once it feels that way, the conclusion seems reasonable before real interaction has even occurred. That's the hinge. The problem isn't only that we form conclusions too quickly. The problem is that we do so without including the other person or the other being in the process of meaning making. We don't remain curious long enough to find out whether what we think we're seeing is actually what's happening. We don't pause long enough to let the interaction tell us more. We move straight from contact into determination while imagining that our determination is simply the natural result of seeing clearly. Now, that move has serious consequences. The moment we assume that our view is sufficient on its own, we stop relating and start assigning value. We decide what this is, we decide whether it counts, and because we imagine ourselves to be outside of the interaction, all of that can feel neutral, but it isn't neutral. You've moved into a position of unilateral determination and have taken up a position above it. That's called interpretive dominance. That's a power position. You're making the other person subject to what you've determined without including them in the process. Now, one of the reasons it's so hard to see is it usually doesn't feel domineering. It doesn't feel like aggression. It doesn't even necessarily feel unkind. It often feels thoughtful or perceptive or sensible or conscious, but the structure is still the same. Meaning's no longer being shaped through interaction. It's being assigned from a position that has removed itself from accountability to the exchange. You can see this in a simple example. Someone around you responds to a situation in a way that you wouldn't. Maybe they're quieter than you'd be, more intense than you'd be, less polished, more stoic, or less quick to explain themselves. And almost immediately you start making meaning. You read them as cold, dramatic, immature, checked out, difficult. Before any real curiosity could have participated, you've already assigned their behavior a place inside of your existing context. You're no longer meeting what's there. You're measuring it against what already makes sense to you, and then treating that measurement like truth. A more relational move looks different. You notice your read forming, but you leave room for the fact that this person has their own way of moving through the world, and that your way is not the universal standard by which everyone else should be measured. You pay attention to the assumptions already organizing your interpretation, whether your read's negative or idealizing. And in either case, you can still refrain from deciding what someone is simply because they're not being or moving the way that you would. Now, the point isn't to have no perspective. The point is to stop treating your perspective as sufficient to define what you're seeing. And that's a different kind of participation. Because we imagine ourselves outside the interaction, our interpretation feels sufficient on its own. And from there, it's easy to assume we have the right to decide what something means. And as soon as that happens, the interaction's no longer being shaped by mutual participation. It's being shaped by whichever interpretation hardens into self-validating certainty rather than by mutual participation in what's actually happening. And this is part of what makes the pattern so ordinary in modern life. We're conditioned inside invisible frames that treat decisive interpretation as a sign of intelligence and certainty as a sign of truth. And very little in modern culture teaches people how to notice how much their own participation is shaping what they take to be real. So the issue here isn't just bias in the abstract, it's the ordinary habit of moving as though one's own perspective is sufficient to determine someone else's existence without sufficient exchange with or undertaking of them. And once you begin to see that, a different question opens. The question is not how to become a more accurate decider. The real question is whether you can recognize that deciding is replacing actual connection. You can begin participating in reality that's still unfolding. You can allow yourself to be informed, affected, and altered by what's actually happening rather than forcing the interaction to conform to what you've already decided. And when we make this pivot, it melts the invisible divide between us because we start to see that actual participation instead of determination reveals that we have a responsibility to connection and to each other. Now, that's the threshold here, to shift out of the addiction to knowing and determining and into lived participation. And this begins by recognizing when your perspective has begun to install itself as authority and when meaning is being fixed through interpretive dominance. Then taking responsibility for that, taking responsibility for why determining feels so safer, more powerful, better than actual discovery and connection. Because once you can take responsibility for that, you can begin interrupting it. And that's where we can start to see that this isn't only personal, it's cultural. Insight can be powerful, but it's not actual transformation. Transformation requires training. Inside the Inner Sanctum, you'll enter structured training for changing how you perceive, respond, and participate in this hot and holy life. Join us inside the temple. Links in description.